Hey, everybody, we are back with another episode of Relational Leadership. We try to come up with topics that will help you in all of your walks of life. And I'm Stephanie Clements.
And I am Shawn Dawley.
And tell us what the topic is today.
Today, we are going to talk about difficult conversations, those things in the workplace that you would rather not engage in, but you recognize that until you have that conversation, whatever the underlying issue is not going to resolve itself. So, we're going to get into that, maybe share some personal stories, always leaving out the names to protect the innocent and not so innocent.
And not so innocent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Um, well, I think, with difficult conversations, being able to have those and knowing how to do them, that's going to help you not only in the workplace, but we have to have difficult conversations with our significant other, with our children, sometimes with our friends. So it really does carry over to every aspect.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, whatever their title is, whether it's coworker, follower, teammate, son,
Yeah.
aunt, they're people, right?
Right.
Those are
Right.
God's children behind those titles. So there's a lot of obvious carryover, right? I mean,
Right.
and now certainly the dynamic can be different. A difficult conversation with somebody you only have to see 40 hours a week or maybe once a month on a Zoom call is going to be different than somebody you live with, but it
Right.
still creates a lot of the same issues.
But it is, I think the biggest thing with these kind of conversations is that it's important about how you approach it and your demeanor and your tone in that if you actually want it to work.
Yeah.
You know, if you walk in and you blow up at somebody, they're immediately on the defense and so there's nothing that you can they're not going to listen.
No. And the very nature of a difficult conversation means that it's probably laced with a significant amount of emotional baggage.
Right.
So as you're, in the car, role playing how this conversation is going to go, you may or may not be capable of having this purely intellectual exercise where you're thinking through your points, your subpoints, the main thesis of your argument. But the second you are sitting across from that person, both you and your counterpart are going to have emotions that are going to be, I dare use the word triggered, based
Right.
on the nature of the conversation. So no, I totally get it, and which is why it's one of the more unpleasant things
Right.
that we have to do, workplace or even in our personal lives.
So, yeah, it's I two conversations come to mind, very quickly for me. And, one was very recent where I had a boss tell me information that kind of it was very disappointing to me. And I sitting here thinking, well, this isn't what you told me before. This isn't and feeling upset. And I sat and I listened through it. And sometimes you have to take some time before, that conversation may not be the time for you to fully share those thoughts because I actually needed some time to process
That's right.
and go through the initial emotions. And then I had to think about, do I just not say anything and go on about my way and this is how it's going to be, or do I go back and explain how it made me feel and how I feel it affects me and things like that. And that was a tough one. I'm not. I don't think any of us are really built for conflict. Although there's a few people, I
Thrive
think
on
they
it.
really
They
do.
in the absence of drama, they'll
Right.
manufacture it. Right.
But I definitely try to avoid conflict when it's possible.
Sure.
And so I did have to go back and I decided, otherwise when we don't talk about our feelings and we bottle resentment grows.
Sure. Sure.
And then that doesn't create a healthy relationship anymore.
Sure.
So I did go back and talk, and in a very, so that when, like I said, the emotion was out, and I
Mhm.
went back and I said, I have to be honest with you, this really disappointed me. And I feel like you had said some of these other things in the past that led me to believe we were going to do
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
And I'm struggling with getting, the
Yeah.
reasoning and whatever. And as it worked out, I mean, we really did sit down and they explained, he explained that issue, but we also came up with a compromise.
Okay.
And so it worked out better. Instead, I could have gone back and just been mad and accepted
Sure.
and been just irritated and it messing up my work relationship.
Well, that exactly, and you could probably use this analogy in different contexts. But you mentioned about, do you let it go and maybe it just simply dissipates into the ether, or is it like that little patch of weeds in the garden that you think, well, I'll not worry about that, and before you know it, they eventually begin to spread.
Right.
And whereas whatever the main thrust that caused the need for that difficult conversation, suddenly, though that might be a fraction of your total relationship with that person, that resentment, like weeds, begins to slowly
Hmm.
spread and find its way into different, areas of the garden. And I appreciated what you said, in that you were cognizant of that it hit you emotionally, and you recognize that, okay, I need to take some time just to let this marinate. Let
Yeah.
me go through the 5 stages of grief or whatever it
Right.
is.
Right.
And then once my emotions have somewhat subsided, I'm now in a better position to more intellectually
Right.
go through the merits of, his or her position, and then the way I, recollect how things were to go. On the flip side, where I have had to give, bad news to people, um, I'm thinking of a time when, like, once a year we would have a pilot selection board, and whether I was the chair or just one of the members, we would end up with maybe 10 or 12 candidates who had been screened, with their resumes from maybe a pool of 60 or 70. And for many of these folks, they were used to being told yes. And these are
Hmm.
high achieving,
Right. Right.
22, 23-year olds with these, like, the kind of resumes you're like, I want you hanging out with, my son or daughter, or dating one. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
these are
Right.
perfect, like all American kids. But there might be one slot. And so after the board, we had made our decision, I then needed to call the 9, 10, 11,
That
and
didn't. Yeah.
yeah, did not get it, and tell them no for maybe the first time in their life. And what I figured out early was, I'm going to let them know the bad news, acknowledge that they're going to be disappointed, and then invite them at some time in the near future to call me back, and we
Hmm.
can have a conversation about how your interview went, my meager insights as to what went right, what you could improve upon. But I realized, don't try to do all that in one conversation.
Right. They've got to feel all of their feelings first, the
Yes.
disappointment, and then once they settle, they can be open to receive it.
Yeah.
And my situation worked out a little bit, in the sense that there was a compromise. However, I was prepared for the fact that that wasn't going to happen. I just needed to express my feelings
Yeah.
either way, and be
Sure.
heard.
Sure.
And, at that point, it was going to be what it was.
Yeah.
But at least I needed to let them know that how I felt.
That's right. Yeah. And there's some, there's some amount of therapeutic, value in that,
Right.
even if it's not going to change, the overall vector of the decision, conveying to somebody. But it also demonstrates some, level of professional respect, where if the person has the legitimate authority to make that decision with which you disagree, as a professional, you can voice disagreement and disappointment,
Right.
and yet still demonstrate, okay, but at the end of the day, the decision was moral, legal, ethical. I am a professional. I can, get on
Right.
board with that.
Right.
But getting that off your chest, I think, does have some amount of value. Yeah.
Sure. And, and like I said, then I had time to also put together my points of why we should move forward with the program, and they were able to see that where I wasn't as prepared before because I didn't know I needed to
Yeah.
convince them on it, you know. So it gave me time to do those things too, and which allowed us to come to a compromise. But, you know, I think now to my kids, because I've really tried to work with them, because again, the downfall of any relationship is not communicating.
Mm.
And if you're only communicating the good things and not the bad things and whatever, it just,
Yeah.
it builds up. And so I've tried to instill that in my kids to be willing to sit down and talk about things. And I did better I have 4 kids. I did better with the younger 2 than I did the first 2
Well,
in the sense
the
of
practice kids.
yes,
Yeah.
the guinea pig kids,
That's right. The older ones typically get, the beta version of
right,
parenting, like it gets perfected,
right.
as you go along, I guess.
So, when they weren't happy with something and they would be like, well, I just don't understand, what? And I was like, well, I'll tell you what, you put together your points. We'll sit down and talk about it. And if you can show me how this is going to be whatever, then, we'll discuss it anyway.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, so it kept a lot of those fights, where kids are going to throw some sort of tantrum because why don't you ever let me do this or whatever. It gave them a chance to have to think about it intellectually too,
Try to open that up.
as to why I might say no.
Yeah.
And now they had to think through it as to why I should say yes.
Well, so I noticed a general commonality between when you were having the conversation with the boss in the workplace setting with your kids. It seemed like in both instances you kept the conversation focused on that issue.
Yeah.
Because what can happen sometimes on either side is that there might be one particular issue which is the catalyst for that conversation, but there had maybe been some of that growing resentment that had expanded out. And before you know it, you think you're about to have a conversation about X.
Right.
And it ends up being about X. And then they start pulling in F and J and
Yeah.
B and a square and a rectangle and, the number 5, it
Right.
can kind of go and it can get away from you. And I know from past experience, when I was on the boss side of the desk, would bring somebody in to have that difficult conversation about a particular issue, and they would start bringing things in, and I found myself getting drugged into this
Right.
like litigation where suddenly we are trying to play the role of Solomon on all these other issues that weren't even tangential. They were just simply completely unrelated.
Right.
So you seem like you've got a more structured approach. Now, is that something that is maybe natural to you, or was it through trial and error?
No, I think that was definitely through trial and error. That was, it was realizing a lot after the downfall of some past relationships that I never communicated, and we can't expect somebody to know what we need sometimes or what we expect of them if they don't know.
Right.
If you've
Sure.
never told them, and instead getting upset with them because they don't just know.
Yeah.
I
Right,
mean,
right.
and I can even find myself with that. It's easy, like with an employee, and it's like, you see what I do, just do those things, but
Yeah.
if you haven't explained it,
Sure. Yeah. I I think I've maybe figured out when I was coming up the ranks that, as much as I look up to some of these leaders, I'm starting to realize they may not be mind readers.
Yeah, right.
Because to some degree, perhaps it's just, youth or naivete. You maybe presume that the people up the chain must be special and therefore they surely understand my hopes and fears the same way I do. And they don't.
Right.
They really don't.
No.
And so one of the things I began to tell folks was that worked for me was, don't expect me to be able to read your mind,
Right.
right? For good or bad. If you have an issue that is bothering you, please feel free to bring that up,
Yeah.
because quite likely there's a very benign explanation.
Yeah.
Not everything is this dark conspiracy.
Right.
And at the same time, if you have aspirations, um, don't presume that your career is more important to me than it is to you. Like you need to tell me what you
Sure.
want. Like you need to be very direct, and you need not feel ashamed that you've got, ambitions, wherever they may lie, but you need to tell me that.
Right.
Like I
Absolutely.
can see all the potential in the world in you, but I don't know how we're going to take all that thrust and provide a vector to it.
Right. Well, I think that also, one of the things I think is really important in the workplace is even doing, whether it's an annual review and things like that.
Mm,
Because again, if you've been doing something wrong for the last year and nobody's told you, you don't know to quit
that's
doing
right.
that.
That's right.
And, if you don't, and that's where it can be that difficult conversation because it's like, oh, I don't want to tell them.
Yeah.
I don't want them to get upset. I don't want them to quit. It's not like that, it's knowing how to approach it and, you know, talking about the good points, but then going, here's some areas that I really feel could use
That's right.
improvement and, you know, keeping emotion out of it and say, but we have to, if you're going to have a well functioning workplace,
Mhm.
you have to have those conversations.
One of my peers, when I was a mid-level officer and I went to Quantico for a year at Marine Corps University, was a Marine infantry officer, and he was a Marines Marine. Like he gives me hope in in the future of the United States military. I mean, this guy was, it's like he was built. He rolled off the assembly line to be a leader of Marines. And I don't know if he coined the phrase, and he's certainly a humble guy, but he wouldn't even take credit for it if he did. But he told me that as a commander, silence is consent. When you don't address it
Yeah.
and you don't like it, the blame shifts from the person doing it to the person in
Right.
charge who's not addressing it. And I thought, my goodness, that's so simplistic and brilliant, because again, everybody that shows up brings not only different motivations, to why they are at that organization, but they bring different experiences, different values, a different ethos.
Yeah.
And therefore, we sometimes make the mistake, just because we're busy. I don't think it's because we're lazy, but we implicitly kind of project our worldview and our values on other people.
Sure.
And so when you see them doing things that are different than how you would do it, you think, now that's weird. Like, why would they do? I would never do that.
Yeah.
Well, they're not you.
Right.
And until you bring it up in whatever appropriate manner you deem, don't expect it to change.
Right.
If they're
Yeah.
doing it, it has inertia, and it's going to continue until acted upon by the outside force, as they
Right.
say in physics. So,
Well, and another reason that we need to be willing to have those discussions is if it is something that you don't want as commonplace in your workplace, what they're doing is going to be seen by other coworkers and it can either spread that way or there can be resentment from other coworkers because they're
absolutely.
not doing it right and why are they getting away with it and so it is important as that leader
Yeah.
to catch things early on, address it and help them get on
Right.
the right path.
Yeah, that's right. And you hit on a key point in that it's not just the particular behavior of the, let's call him or her, the offending employee. By you not addressing it, other people see that, and now the problem is confined to whatever it is, but it's creating this broader problem. Like, man, so let's just say that the issue is tardiness. Okay, let's say that it is clearly established that 8 a.m.
Right.
we all need to be here. Well, if somebody routinely rolls in at 8:03, 8:08, the majority of other professionals are not going to start coming to work late because they don't need a boss to tell them to be on time.
Right.
They will show up on time. But when they see somebody just routinely being less than punctual and nothing seems to happen about it, that can really begin to corrode,
Yeah.
some of
The
and
morale
it's,
and the
over such a small thing. And suddenly the issue of the unaddressed tardiness begins to creep into, other aspects of the
right,
company's,
right.
vibe, where the leader could have nipped that one in the bud.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
when that happens, Stephanie, so let's just use that as an example. When you are going to bring somebody in, and let's use the example that they seem to be late a
Yeah.
lot. How does that conversation go? When you have somebody, so this is an adult, okay, this
Yeah.
is a workplace professional, and you've got to bring him in and give him a little bit of a talking to. What does that look like?
I think that is, again, I like to start with things that I see them doing well,
Okay.
but say, but there are some issues here. I'm seeing you come in, anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes late. And while that doesn't seem to be a big deal, you know, our starting time is 8 o'clock. And it means you should be here and ready to work at 8 o'clock. So, what can we do to help you with that? Is there something going on
Mm.
in the mornings? Is there something, because, oh, traffic gets bad. And like, okay, let's discuss. Maybe we leave 10 minutes earlier, or,
Right.
and I understand that occasionally you can't help what's going to happen in traffic.
Sure.
There's a pile up on the interstate and nobody's moving. And,
Yeah.
so that's going to happen on
Hmm.
occasion.
Hmm.
But we know that traffic is going to be bad rush hour traffic every day. So it seems that it is a 5 to 10 minute thing. So let's plan that. Or, maybe they can't drop their kid off before a certain time. And so it's understanding at that point too. I mean, that's something that probably should have been brought up
Right.
before the hire. But and if I say, okay, so you can't drop your kid off before this time and you can't get here really before 5 after, what I need you to do is, you know, because I don't want people to feel like you're not equal and pulling your weight. And I get that when you're here, you're putting your all into it, but maybe lunch then or whatever, you're staying 5 minutes past, just let's
Sure.
make it up
Sure.
somewhere.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's again with the hypothetical. There's always going to be some nuance and
Right.
sometimes you discover some things like, okay, okay, now I can understand. It doesn't necessarily mean I condone, but you've now provided me some insights that help me understand. But yes, somehow, some way, it needs to be resolved, and you don't publicly flog somebody.
Right.
But if the behavior had been noticed by a significant number of
Yeah.
workers, there needs to be some degree of public resolution,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that's always tricky. That's and
It is. Yeah. Because
yeah,
you don't want to go out and go, okay, well,
right,
it's going to continue to be late for the next,
right, yeah. You're not going to put it in the weekly,
Right.
company bulletin, or
Right.
send out a mass text to everybody.
But just, them seeing though that the level of effort, um, I had to actually have this conversation with an employee who was taking, multiple smoke breaks.
Mm.
And the people who don't take smoke breaks were getting irritated because, 10 minutes out of every hour, this
Starts to
person
add up.
isn't
Yeah.
working and the rest of
Yeah.
us are in here working.
Right.
And so, I did have to have that conversation that, there's going to have to be fewer of these. And, you do get 2 10-minute breaks through the day and then a lunch hour, but we're going to have to try to limit that. If you need to wear a patch, if you need to wear something to get you through.
Yeah. Smoke 2 cigarettes at once.
Right.
Transition to chewing tobacco.
Right. But something that, helps because it was, I was
Yeah.
having other employees who were getting
Yeah.
irritated because they're
Yeah.
like, we're here working the whole time.
Yeah.
They're still making the same amount of money and they're still, everybody's
Yeah.
getting paid for the same hours.
Right. And again, that's where the problem that is being caused by somebody eventually results in the leader being the one that people's animosity is directed
Right,
towards. Like
right.
why will not the why won't you do something about this?
Yeah,
And you can't be everywhere at once, and sometimes you don't see these things
sure.
maybe, but they do.
Right.
They're they're watching. They're not only watching the behavior and the, again, I'll use the word offending individual. They're watching you. Like,
Yeah,
well, okay, what is she going to do about it?
right.
Uh, when you said something earlier about perhaps trying to lead with some positivity.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I I go back and forth on that,
Yeah.
depending on the nature, right?
Sure, and it depends on how irritated I really am with
That's right. That's right. Because
it.
bosses are people too, right?
Right.
Even leaders are allowed to have emotions. So I feel like there's a spectrum of difficult conversations.
Yeah,
There's the quick pull somebody to the side. Hey, if you could please not use that language in meetings, that'd be
sure.
appreciated, right? Then at the other extreme is, have a seat. This is Detective so and so that's going to be investigating the case because you've been embezzling from the company, right? So there's a spectrum of difficult conversations. Um, when I would have those annual performance reports, and I would sit people down and we would go through, the body of work. Uh, they always had plenty of wonderful things, right? But I would always use that opportunity after I had sincerely, brought out the wonderful things they had done,
Mhm.
to provide my humble insights as to things that I thought they could do better,
Sure.
right? And there's actually, I feel like, a significant amount of compassion and respect when you look somebody in the eye and tell them, "Hey, you're doing this pretty good. I think you could be great at it."
Yeah.
Some people struggle with any sort of feedback that could be even remotely critical.
Right, right.
But at the end of the day, if you are telling somebody that you're good, you're above average, I think you've got the capacity, the potential to be rare.
Right.
Um, if they believe that you genuinely
That
care
you genuinely
about,
care and
yeah,
believe
yeah,
that.
that's right. They're going to typically, receive that as such, right? I mean,
Sure.
if you've established that, that lane of trust with them, they're more inclined to take that feedback,
Yeah.
as opposed to if the only time they ever hear from you is when you're pointing out little flaws, little mistakes, little errors. They're just going to, in one ear, out the
Right.
other.
Well, another thing that I like with, performance reviews is, you know, for my employees, I ask them to review themselves. Tell me what you feel like you do best. Tell me some things that you think you could improve on so that they are having to like try and think objectively about themselves
Hmm.
also. And
Sure.
then that leads into some conversation where they're like, "Okay, I've already admitted I could do this better."
Sure.
And, so let's start here on
Makes your
that.
job easier, right?
Yeah.
When they lead with it.
Yeah.
I so similarly, after every flight, that we ever flew in the Air Force, there would always be a debrief.
Right.
And in some circumstances, some of these people were so gosh darn hard on themselves. I had to pull them back from the ledge. I'm like, man, like, okay, yes, I agree that maybe there was a couple of things here, but
Right. But you were a lot better
you're
than you
beating
said.
yourself up, right? And I say that as a, oh my goodness, nobody can beat me up like I can, beat
Oh,
myself up.
absolutely.
So
We're
maybe
always our
maybe
own
that
worst
may be a
critic.
little more, empathetic to that approach. But you know, in those
Well,
circ-
and those things do give you, if they've done that, it does give you a chance to build them up with that.
yeah,
You've at least got the opportunity to either agree or to build them up.
that's sure, that's right. And I some people more than others need external validation. I think we all want external validation. Like it feels good when
It
somebody says,
does.
"Hey, good job," right? Um, but especially as professionals, when somebody if for no other reason than they are older than you and are farther along in their career, but is somebody that you look up to, um, gives you that validation.
Right.
Uh, that can really go a long way. Uh, Now, on the other end of the spectrum are those times when you're bringing somebody in and it's not their annual performance report. It's not a quick aside, but
Right.
it's something significant.
Right.
In in the instance where it is a legitimate fatal infraction, like you're being terminated,
Right.
like this by itself as a standalone mistake or willful act is grounds for termination. Okay, that's a different thing.
Sure.
But when you're bringing somebody in, because there is a single distinct problem that they caused, I've found those to be the most emotionally draining.
Oh yeah.
For me, do you have any that you can think of like that? Again, we'll make sure we sanitize the details.
Right. Right. So yeah, I have where I had to call it an employee, and that was was really I was to the end of my wits with
Mm,
them, but I was still hoping and trying to see if they were willing
right.
to correct their behavior some. And you know, I will say some of these I've done much better than others, because again, we're human and we can get emotional
Hmm.
too. Um, but yeah, I mean that's probably the toughest of the tough
Yeah.
conversations where you just have to discuss. Um, Listen, I mean, we've enjoyed working with you or whatever, but right now, here's some things that I can't
Yeah.
overlook. And this reflects on the company, our employees, and so this is just something that
Yeah.
we can't let go. So we're going to have to part ways here.
Yeah. Yeah. And depending on where you work, there's going to be any number of HR required
Sure,
protocols to follow and
sure.
things like that. But having had to terminate people in the past, one thing I figured out was I can't spend 3 or 4 minutes basically clearing my throat because I'm uneasy about it.
Right,
If you start with, well, there's some macroeconomic trends that are creating some financial constraints, and our productivity is down in this quarter. At some point, they're going to go, "Am I getting fired?"
yeah,
Right? So, you if you're going to do that, I feel like those words need to come out of your mouth
pretty
in
quick.
the
Yeah.
first 30 seconds.
Hmm.
Short of that, when I've had to bring somebody in who wasn't being terminated but had done something, it was a standalone act or lack of an act that necessitated this difficult conversation. What I realized, found out kind of through trial and error, was that unlike a conversation where I was going to talk about some generalities, like, okay,
Hmm.
hey, you tend to get a little bit gruff with people during emergencies or what have you. That is a relatively generalized conversation that still needed to be
Yeah.
had, but it wasn't something singular
Right.
egregious act. When it is something like that, what I figured out was I need to if I'm going to formally reprimand somebody, I'm going to write out concisely but with enough specificity to convey the point. And we're not going to adjudicate this like it's a court.
Right.
I am going to deliver this message, probably going to have a witness, um, maybe even have them sign an acknowledgement that they have been told this. Now, they will have a chance to rebut.
Right.
And like we mentioned earlier, give them a chance to emotionally, process and go through that, climax of intensity. And then they can come back and address it later, but, or maybe even in their own written form. But what I found worked best for me was if I'm going to have to confront somebody over
Yeah.
something specific is don't go in there without a plan.
Yeah.
It needs to be crystal clear what the issue is, what your future expectations are, and it needs to be conveyed to them quickly, clearly, and comprehensively. And then after they
Sure.
acknowledge it, you go about your day, and then we can come back, and if you'd like to address it later, we'll do that. But there was a couple times early on where I thought we would just have this conversation. I would say what I was going to say, and that they would receive it as such, and it's not
Right. I mean,
not how
it's
it
an
works.
emotional thing. Again, emotions get in the way, whether it's at home or at work or whatever. But we are just about, I think, out of time.
Well, it goes by quick.
But it is. I mean, we could, as you're talking, I mean, lots of other things coming into my head, and I'm like, we're at the end of our time. But
Sure.
we appreciate any of you who joined in. And if you like this, we would appreciate you liking and sharing it. You can find us now on Spotify. So, Relational Leadership on Spotify. So, we would love for you to, share it with friends and family, and give us some feedback. And as we move forward with new topics, if you have questions that you would
Yeah.
like us to address on these, um, feel free to put those in the event or message us. And, we would love to have some of your questions as we're going forward.
Absolutely.
So thank you again for joining, and we will see you next week.
See you next week.